In the silence between wars, the world leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves shadows that refuse to vanish, buried beneath forgotten airfields, locked inside vaults of ash, scattered across frozen seas and polar skies. There exist fragments of history that were never meant to be seen, whispered through coded signals, hidden in erased documents, and etched into landscapes where no one should have been. These fragments hint at a deeper conflict. They speak of experiments no government admits to, convoys that sailed into storms of silence, and transmissions from voices that should have been extinguished long ago. They are not stories of victory or defeat, but of truths concealed, traded, or abandoned in the name of survival. Step into the archives of the unexplained, where every page turned is stained with secrecy, and every silence holds the weight of something deliberately forgotten. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Murmansk. On the night of December 16, 1942, Convoy JW51B departed from Loch Ewe, Scotland, bound for Murmansk with 14 merchant vessels escorted by destroyers and smaller warships. Official records list this as one of many Arctic supply missions to sustain the Soviet war effort. Yet what unfolded in the Barents Sea was unlike any other engagement of the convoy wars. For decades, the accepted account held that German U-boats and surface raiders forced the convoy into confusion and eventual destruction, with more than half the ships lost to torpedo and shell fire. But fragments of declassified Admiralty files and Soviet memoranda tell a darker and more calculated story, one that suggests JW51B may never have been intended to survive its passage. Intercepted German naval signals, decrypted through the Bletchley Park Ultra program, revealed to British intelligence that the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet, including the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and the pocket battleship Lutzow, were moving north from Norway. Yet despite these warnings, Admiralty orders instructed JW51B to continue into the Barents without rerouting or reinforcement. Surviving escorts later testified that their requests for air cover from the Royal Air Force were delayed or outright ignored. By December 30th, when German forces engaged, the convoy had been scattered across ice-choked waters with minimal coordination, leaving merchantmen isolated and vulnerable. What little remains of Operation Silent Frost, a designation found in a redacted Admiralty planning document, indicates that the convoy itself may have been designated as bait. In one uncensored line of a December 1942 memo, Rear Admiral Lancelot Holland remarked on the necessity to draw out German surface vessels in order to test the effectiveness of new jamming protocols. The jamming referenced appears to have been tied to experimental radar countermeasures involving acoustic interference and frequency scrambling. Testimony from able seaman Thomas Rook of HMS Achates, later given in a sealed Ministry of Defense interview, described a sound like a humming wall that disrupted sonar, causing escorts to lose contact with approaching torpedoes until impact. Rook claimed the interference was not from the Germans, but generated from within their own escort group. His account was buried under classification until 1986. Survivor reports preserved in Soviet archives provide further anomalies. A Russian sailor from the merchant ship Sukona described how, moments before his vessel was struck, the ship's radio operator complained that our frequencies are blinded, receiving bursts of static resembling Morse patterns rather than atmospheric noise. NKVD officers debriefed survivors upon arrival in Murmansk, but their reports were not released until after the Soviet collapse. The surviving fragments point to suspicions that the British had deliberately exposed Soviet crews to untested electronic warfare in order to evaluate Axis. Responses. The human toll of JW51B was staggering. Of the convoy's 14 merchant ships, 8 were sunk. The destroyer HMS Bramble was obliterated after engaging the Admiral Hipper alone, while HMS Achates was lost under sustained bombardment. Rescue operations were hampered by extreme weather, and dozens of survivors froze in open rafts before they could be recovered. Yet despite this carnage, official communiques in both London and Moscow hailed the mission as a success, citing the damage inflicted on German ships and their subsequent withdrawal. The Admiralty's press office released carefully worded statements, praising the bravery of the escort crews and emphasizing the survival of critical supplies. Though internal records prove most, cargo never reached Soviet soil. After the war, the Murmansk disaster was folded into broader narratives of the Arctic convoys as heroic sacrifices. Few questioned the inconsistencies until the mid-1970s, when an academic study of naval records revealed anomalies in the convoy's wireless traffic. Signals that should have been routine were either missing or replaced by vague directives to maintain course at all costs. Naval historians attempting to access the operational logs of HMS Onslow, the convoy's escort leader, found entire sections removed under the Official Secrets Act. In 1982, following a limited declassification of wartime documents, a Ministry of Defense archivist named Leonard Price stumbled upon references to silent frost in cross-indexed files relating to Admiralty research divisions. He copied a handful of documents before they were reclassified. According to Price, the material suggested that the convoy had been used to test both Allied and Axis susceptibility to radar and sonar distortion. One passage described frequency distortion tests under live fire conditions. Another referenced controlled release of merchant targets for observation. Price gave interviews in 1986, but was warned by officials against further disclosure, citing national security. The Soviets, too, maintained their silence. In a 1991 Russian television documentary, a retired naval officer claimed that Stalin had received a detailed report on the loss of JW-51B. The report concluded that the British had knowingly sacrificed Soviet ships and sailors in order to experiment with countermeasures, but Stalin chose not to publicize this, viewing the alliance as too fragile to expose duplicity. Instead, the disaster was reframed as a symbol of Allied resolve in the face of German naval aggression. To this day, questions linger over the fate of JW-51B. Why were escort reinforcements withheld despite advanced knowledge of German movements? Why do logs from multiple vessels contain identical wording, as though dictated by outside censors? And why did both London and Moscow maintain the fiction of success despite overwhelming losses? The human memory of the Murmansk disaster is found in scattered accounts like that of Petty Officer William Dawes, who wrote in his private diary, later discovered among his family's effects, that we were led into the ice like lambs, and the orders never made sense. Someone wanted to see how we would burn, how we would drown, and what the Hun would do to finish it. His words were never published during his lifetime. Official histories continue to present JW-51B as a tragic but necessary sacrifice in the long Arctic campaign. Yet the more closely one examines the fragments, the intercepted signals, the testimonies suppressed for decades, the vanished convoy logs, the clearer it becomes that the disaster was not the result of mere miscalculation. It was, perhaps, the deliberate erasure of 36 vessels into the cold silence of the Barents, leaving behind nothing but censored records and unanswered questions. The Murmansk disaster remains buried beneath redacted pages and conflicting testimonies, a cold file that refuses to close. Families of lost sailors still lack definitive answers, while the true nature of Operation Silent Frost remains locked in sealed archives. Whether experiment, betrayal, or simply bureaucratic negligence at its most lethal, the vanished convoy has become a shadow chapter in naval history, one that neither Britain nor Russia has ever fully allowed to surface. The silence around JW-51B endures, like the frozen waters that swallowed it whole. Chapter 2. Operation Ashen Vaults of Berlin. In the closing days of April 1945, as Berlin descended into rubble and chaos, the Soviet First Belarusian Front advanced through the city with one particular map folded into their orders. Marked not with streets or buildings, but with cryptic alphanumeric grids, it pointed toward the underground chambers beneath Tempelhof Airport. Soviet officers referred to it only as Object 12. While German command was fixated on the collapsing front lines, engineers from Organization Todt and technical staff from the Luftwaffe had been working for months in these reinforced basements, building structures that Allied reconnaissance dismissed as fuel storage depots. In truth, they were constructing a vault meant to secure technological assets and experimental material from falling into enemy hands. The first Soviet units to breach Tempelhof were from the 301st Rifle Division. They reported unusually heavy resistance around entrances to the underground tunnels, suggesting the Wehrmacht had been instructed to protect something more vital than mere airfield infrastructure. When Red Army sappers forced their way into the subterranean levels on April 27th, they discovered corridors lined with crates, stenciled KMW Flugmotor and Auer Metallwerke. Among them were canisters of uranium oxide, refined to a degree that shocked even the Soviet engineers present. Within hours, NKVD security detachments under Colonel Lavrenti Shcherbakov sealed the vault and ordered all findings classified under direct instructions from Moscow. The Americans, aware through OSS intercepts that the Soviets were targeting Object 12, prepared their own counter-operation known as Dustpan. According to declassified fragments of a July 1945 intelligence memorandum, the OSS intended to retrieve surviving German engineers from the Tempelhof complex before they could be absorbed into Soviet custody. Dozens of Luftwaffe technicians and metallurgists were identified, including a man referred to in OSS reports only as Engineer H, believed to have worked on turbine miniaturization. Many of these individuals later resurfaced under American patronage in Operation Paperclip, their wartime files conspicuously absent from Allied war crimes archives. Captured documents suggest the vaults contained more than raw materials. Technical drawings recovered by Soviet units depicted small, cylindrical engines with unconventional air intake designs. These bore similarities to later Soviet developments in ramjet and pulsejet systems. A separate cache included blueprints labeled Morgenlicht, describing aerodynamic forms resembling unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. Though incomplete, the plans hinted at ambitions beyond conventional Luftwaffe projects. The fate of these documents is uncertain. Soviet archives indicate they were transferred to Facility No. 2 near Moscow, but subsequent references vanish after 1947. American intelligence was not ignorant of these discoveries. OSS field cables from Berlin to London referenced ash vaults and special cargo relocated to Moscow. The State Department grew concerned that the Soviets had obtained resources accelerating their nuclear program. In fact, within a year, Stalin had authorized the creation of the Special Committee on the Atomic Project, chaired by Lavrenti Beria, which drew extensively on captured German materials. Western intelligence analysts later speculated that the Tempelhof uranium oxide contributed directly to the early Soviet enrichment program at Elektrostal. Though this remains contested, witnesses who entered the vaults gave conflicting accounts of what they saw. Sergeant Ivan Petrov of the 301st Rifle Division recalled in an oral history interview recorded in 1972 that he saw rows of engines, not for tanks or planes we knew, but something smaller, stranger, as if meant for a craft without a pilot. His testimony was quietly archived and only released after the collapse of the Soviet Union. By contrast, a former Luftwaffe engineer interrogated by American forces claimed the vaults held nothing but spare parts. The contradictions have only deepened suspicions that both sides sought to conceal the true contents of Object 12. What is certain is that the Tempelhof vaults were systematically emptied within days of discovery. Soviet transport manifests list 24 sealed train cars departing Berlin on May 3, 1945, guarded by NKVD troops. Their declared cargo: technical apparatus and scrap metal. But when cross-referenced with photographic evidence taken by US reconnaissance planes, the trains bore reinforced flat cars carrying oversized containers consistent with heavy machinery. The trail disappears once the trains reach the Smolensk rail junction. Beyond that, the record is silent. American counterintelligence scrambled to fill the void. Reports filed by the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, in June 1945 describe frantic efforts to interrogate captured German personnel about Tempelhof materials. One name appears repeatedly: Professor Ernst Kaltenbrunner, not to be confused with the SS official, but a metallurgist attached to Auer Metallwerke. According to CIC notes, he claimed his team had been ordered to refine uranium oxide under direct supervision of Reich Ministry officials. Kaltenbrunner insisted the material was intended for experimental reactors in Thuringia, but offered no evidence. He was relocated to the United States under Operation Paperclip, his post-war work quietly integrated into nuclear research programs. The British, too, had their own interest. MI6 files declassified in 2002 reveal that Prime Minister Churchill personally asked for a summary of ash vault findings during a briefing in July 1945. The summary concluded that the Soviets had acquired material of potential used to a chain reaction apparatus, diplomatic language, masking the alarming possibility that Berlin's ruins had yielded the keys to atomic weaponry. For decades, official histories of the Battle of Berlin made no mention of Object 12 or the Tempelhof vaults. Only with the trickle of declassified material in the 1980s and 1990s did fragments emerge, enough to suggest a concealed race to exploit the technological detritus of the collapsing Reich. The story fits uncomfortably with the narrative of post-war justice, where Allied powers supposedly dismantled the Nazi war machine for peace. Instead, it points to a scramble to appropriate what could be salvaged, regardless of its origin or the crimes tied to its creation. The ash vaults of Berlin remain a shadowed chapter in the larger story of World War II's endgame. Beneath the city's rubble, amid collapsing walls and dying soldiers, a different kind of battle was fought. Not for land or ideology, but for the possession of knowledge and material that could shape the next war. Stalin's secrecy ensured that the world never saw the contents of those crates, while Western silence prevented scrutiny of their own parallel efforts. Today, researchers attempting to trace the fate of Object 12 encounter redacted documents, missing files, and deliberate disinformation. Some argue the material was integrated seamlessly into Soviet research, its origins erased by design. Others suggest much was destroyed, deemed unusable or too dangerous to reveal. Yet the fact remains, in those final days of Berlin, while civilians starved and soldiers died, beneath the ruins of Tempelhof lay vaults that may have contained the seeds of the Cold War's most destructive race. The story of the Ashen vaults has never been fully told. What surfaced has come only in fragments, whispered in footnotes and buried in archives. The rest remains sealed behind the black ink of classification, hidden away like the vaults themselves, deep underground, waiting for an answer that may never be given. Chapter 3. The Erased Files of Unit 731. In August 1945, Japan surrendered under the weight of atomic devastation, and the world turned its eyes to Tokyo, expecting full disclosure of the crimes carried out in Asia. Yet the darkest chapter of Japanese warfare, Unit 731, never received a complete reckoning. Based in Pingfang, near Harbin in Manchuria, Unit 731 was the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Army's Biological Warfare Division. For years, prisoners of war and civilians were subjected to experiments in plague, cholera, frostbite, and vivisection. While fragments of this story emerged during the Khabarovsk trials in 1949, the most critical files, those detailing procedures, dispersal methods, and data, vanished into silence. What little is known suggests that American intelligence orchestrated the disappearance of these records in exchange for exclusive access. Immediately after Japan's surrender, General Douglas MacArthur's staff dispatched a special detachment to Manchuria under the codename Operation Blacklist. While officially tasked with disarming Japanese forces, the detachment moved with unusual precision toward Pingfang. By September, they had seized laboratories and warehouses, gathering crates of documents marked only with kanji symbols for epidemic prevention. According to a declassified cable dated October 12, 1945, General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, informed Washington that certain experimental files of strategic value were secured and should be transferred to Fort Detrick, Maryland. Within months, those crates were no longer visible in occupation records. The Soviets, who had advanced into Manchuria earlier that August, were also aware of the atrocities. NKVD officers interrogated surviving staff, many of whom claimed that the Americans had already extracted key documents. In 1946, during pre-trial discussions for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Soviet prosecutors demanded disclosure of all evidence pertaining to Japanese biological warfare. The US delegation, however, dismissed these requests as propaganda. Behind closed doors, American officials were negotiating immunity agreements with Unit 731 personnel, including its commander, General Shiro Ishii. In exchange for sparing them from prosecution, the United States sought full access to their research. The files themselves became ghosts. Between 1946 and 1948, multiple shipments labeled medical archives left Yokohama aboard US military transports. Cargo manifests described them only as confidential records, scientific. Declassified customs papers confirm their arrival in Guam and later in San Francisco, yet no inventory survives. Historians who attempted to trace these shipments in the National Archives found only blank entries or folders stamped "withdrawn by authority." When pressed, Pentagon spokesmen claimed the documents had been misplaced, but numerous insiders insist they were deliberately withheld. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal made only passing reference to Unit 731. Testimonies about live dissections, plague bomb tests, and field trials using Chinese villagers were quietly excluded from the official record. Behind this erasure was a geopolitical calculation. The United States, entering a new confrontation with the Soviet Union, saw in these files a strategic advantage. Disease vectors, dispersal mechanisms, and resistance data gathered through human experimentation could accelerate America's own biological warfare program. Fort Detrick became the center of this transfer, with scientists quietly referencing data acquired in the Pacific Theater. Japanese doctors implicated in these crimes resurfaced in unexpected places. Dr. Masaji Kitano, Ishii's deputy, became president of a major pharmaceutical company in post-war Japan. Other staff integrated into universities, some even lecturing on microbiology without ever facing a court. Their names appear sporadically in employment rosters, yet their wartime affiliations were rarely mentioned. The immunity granted to them was never publicized, leaving victims' families without acknowledgement, let alone justice. In 1981, a former American intelligence officer, William Powell, published a series of investigative articles alleging that the US government had deliberately erased evidence of Japanese war crimes to secure biological data. Powell cited internal memos in which Fort Detrick scientists praised the uniqueness of Unit 731's records, calling them unobtainable through conventional research. His revelations drew outrage in Japan, but Washington denied their authenticity, insisting no such files existed. Nonetheless, Powell's claims aligned with testimonies from Soviet prosecutors at Khabarovsk, who had argued decades earlier that the Americans shielded Ishii and his staff. The most chilling detail emerges from survivor accounts of Harbin residents, some of which were recorded only in local Chinese archives. Witnesses described being forced to watch black ceramic bombs tested in fields, releasing fleas infected with plague. One farmer recalled entire villages quarantined and then erased after outbreaks, with survivors transported to Pingfang's laboratories. These testimonies, largely unknown outside regional records, reinforce the scope of the atrocities. Yet they remain absent from international archives because the files that could corroborate them were siphoned away. By the 1990s, as Japan faced mounting pressure to acknowledge wartime crimes, documents began to resurface piecemeal. A 1995 disclosure from the US Department of Defense admitted that certain datasets from Unit 731 had been integrated into Cold War-era programs. However, the files themselves remained classified. In 2003, researchers petitioned under the Freedom of Information Act to access Fort Detrick records, but most pages were returned fully redacted. The surviving fragments referenced aerosol dispersal tests, human thermal response trials, and pathogen resistance curves. Each fragment hinted at larger datasets that remained sealed. The erasure of Unit 731 files was not merely a matter of concealment, but of deliberate repurposing. By laundering atrocity data into scientific projects, the US ensured it became indistinguishable from legitimate research. This allowed perpetrators to disappear into peacetime roles while their victims were forgotten. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors faced public judgment, Japan's biological war criminals slipped into obscurity, protected by the very powers that should have prosecuted them. The absence of justice left scars across Asia. Chinese families who lost relatives to experiments were denied recognition for decades. Korean victims were silenced, their testimonies dismissed as unreliable. Even within Japan, survivors of plague outbreaks faced stigma and disbelief. Without the files, proving the scale of Unit 731's crimes became nearly impossible, allowing skeptics to cast doubt on survivor accounts. The erased files of Unit 731 remain a void in the historical record, a void created by conscious design. Their disappearance shielded perpetrators, shaped Cold War research, and deprived victims of acknowledgement. While fragments surface occasionally, an uncatalogued diary, a misfiled cable, a survivor's testimony, they are not enough to reconstruct the full scope of the atrocities. Instead, the story of Unit 731 is told in shadows, in the blank pages of withdrawn archives, in the careful omissions of tribunal transcripts, and in the silence of governments unwilling to confront the price of their bargains. What lies hidden in those vanished crates shipped from Harbin to American shores may never be revealed. Yet their absence speaks louder than their presence. It tells of a world that chose expedience over justice, secrecy over truth. The erased files are not just missing documents. They are the stolen voices of thousands who died behind the walls of Pingfang, reduced to data points in an archive that no one is permitted to read. Their silence remains one of the most haunting legacies of the Second World War. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Arctic. Listening Posts. When the Second World War ended, the Arctic became more than a frozen frontier. It was transformed into one of the Cold War's most secretive arenas. The distant early warning line, stretching across Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, was publicly described as a chain of radar stations meant to detect Soviet bombers. Yet declassified fragments and testimonies from technicians reveal that these listening posts were built not only to monitor Soviet skies, but also to intercept transmissions that should not have existed at all. Under an internal designation known as Project Cold Echo, signals officers stationed at Ellesmere Island and Baffin Bay reported hearing encrypted bursts of Morse code that matched obsolete Kriegsmarine cipher patterns, broadcasts, supposedly silenced with the scuttling of the last U-boats in May 1945. The first documented incident occurred in March 1952. U.S. Air Force technician Sergeant Edward Harlan noted a shortwave transmission received at Station Fox 3, near Resolute Bay. The signal carried the call sign U-530, the same designation as a German submarine that had surrendered in Argentina 7 years earlier. Harlan filed a report describing the transmission as brief positional data in Enigma-derived format. His superiors ordered the report sealed and instructed him never to discuss it again. Similar incidents followed in 1953 and 1954, with Canadian operators claiming they picked up phantom signals referencing grid coordinates in the North Atlantic, positions where wrecked U-boats lay rusting on the seabed. Official explanations attributed the anomalies to atmospheric bounce, a phenomenon in which old signals allegedly linger in the ionosphere and re-emerge years later. Yet this theory collapses under scrutiny. Morse code bursts were not random echoes but structured, with headers and endings consistent with active transmissions. In one striking case, an operator at WWII station Cam 5 recorded a string of numerals followed by the German word bereit. The recording was confiscated by visiting US Air Force officers and never seen again. Personnel present recall being ordered to sign confidentiality oaths under penalty of court-martial. The secrecy surrounding these phantom broadcasts grew intense. Internal memoranda from the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, partially declassified in 1987, reveal that High Command labeled them post-hostility residual operations. The term appears nowhere else in Cold War archives, and its definition was left deliberately vague. Some historians believe it referred to the possibility that remnants of the Kriegsmarine or their intelligence apparatus had survived in exile, operating covertly into the 1950s. Others suspect the broadcasts were manufactured by Western agencies themselves, used as a justification for the immense financial and strategic investment in Arctic militarization. The human toll of these operations should not be overlooked. Isolated for months in sub-zero conditions, radar technicians often suffered psychological strain, made worse by the knowledge that their monitoring equipment picked up signals no one could explain. Diaries of Canadian operators describe nights when static seemed to give way to patterns, as if the war had not ended. In one haunting account, Corporal James Matthews wrote in 1955 that he heard a familiar war song tapped out in Morse, like ghosts playing on the wire. His entry was later torn from the notebook before it was filed into military records. During the 1960s, as technology improved, the mysterious signals diminished. By then, the DEW line had expanded into the ballistic missile early warning system, and the phantom transmissions ceased to be reported in official channels. Yet veterans of the line continued to speak quietly of Cold Echo well into retirement. Some gathered at reunions shared stories of hearing not only Morse code but occasional German speech in distorted bursts, as if from a submarine radio operator broadcasting across decades. The Soviets too were aware of these anomalies. A 1964 KGB analytical report leaked after the Soviet Union's collapse mentioned Western Arctic surveillance detecting unexplained German signals. The report speculated that the transmissions could have been staged to create paranoia and to strengthen NATO presence in the Arctic, but the KGB admitted uncertainty, noting that their own listening stations in Murmansk had once intercepted faint Morse traffic resembling old German Navy protocols. Project Cold Echo remained buried until the late 1980s, when fragments of NORAD files were declassified under public pressure. Among the fragments was a single-page summary noting repeated unauthorized transmissions, origin unknown, presumed technical anomaly. Yet handwritten in the margin was a chilling note. Not anomaly. Confirmed pattern encrypted, source withheld. The author's identity remains redacted. The debate continues today. Some researchers argue the signals were remnants of wartime German units that fled to South America or remote bases, maintaining contact long after surrender. Others contend they were psychological operations by NATO, meant to keep technicians alert and justify expenditures. The absence of full files, the confiscation of recordings, and the enforced silence of those stationed in the Arctic make definitive conclusions impossible. The Arctic listening posts stand abandoned now, their antennas rusting in the cold wind. Yet for those who manned them, the memory of phantom signals lingers like frostbite scars. They recall long nights staring at dials, headphones filled with static that suddenly resolved into an echo of a war everyone believed finished. Whether these echoes came from lost German transmissions or from the manipulations of their own superiors, the effect was the same, an enduring sense that the shadows of the Second World War stretched far longer than official histories allow. The DWII line is remembered publicly as a defensive shield against Soviet bombers. Privately, it was also a netcast into the frozen silence, catching whispers that should not have been there. The fact that those whispers were never explained, only silenced, ensures that Project Cold Echo remains one of the Cold War's most unsettling mysteries. Like the static-laden Morse bursts that vanished into confiscated tape reels, the truth has been erased, leaving behind only the shadows that drift across the Arctic ice. Chapter 5. The Ghost Airfields of North Africa. In the spring of 1943, as Rommel's Africa Corps retreated westward across Libya, Allied survey teams followed closely behind, mapping the desert for future operations. What they found in the wastes south of Tobruk and deep into the Fezzan astonished them. Skeletal runways carved into rock, half-assembled hangars, and crude workshops far beyond conventional supply lines. These were not ordinary forward airfields. Captured German blueprints referred to them as Project Morgenstern, a codename absent from official Luftwaffe records. The drawings suggested an intention to launch unconventional aircraft capable of ranges exceeding anything in the German arsenal at the time. The British files that first described these sites were classified under the Air Ministry's Special Technical Reports series. A surviving entry, dated May 1943, describes one location approximately 280 kilometers south of Sirte. The report notes 3 incomplete fuselages, unmanned configuration, wingspan of approximately 8 meters, tubular housing resembling pulse jet assembly. RAF engineers identified components resembling scaled-down versions of the Argus AS-014 engine, the same used on the V-1 flying bomb, though none had yet been operational in North Africa. The airstrips themselves were crude but vast, laid out in parallel fashion, as if intended for mass launches rather than conventional takeoffs and landings. Contemporary Allied officers expressed disbelief. Building such facilities in desert expanses far from ports or railheads defied military logic, yet evidence collected on-site included fuel drums, wing spars, and wiring harnesses consistent with advanced prototype work. A handful of photographs were taken before orders arrived to dismantle and bury the installations. The images vanished into restricted archives. One RAF squadron leader, writing privately in his diary, noted that these machines are not meant for pilots, nor for this war. They are sketches of a future we are not meant to see. In parallel, American intelligence initiated their own investigation under the codename Project Sundial, cable from US Army Air Force's intelligence. To Washington, dated June 1943, reported that the Germans had been experimenting with long-range reconnaissance craft, possibly unmanned, designed for launch from remote airstrips. The cable emphasized that these prototypes, if operational, could have threatened Allied shipping lanes or even reached the Mediterranean coast with minimal detection. No such missions were ever recorded, but the mere discovery suggested German engineers were pushing toward concepts decades ahead of their time. The Germans themselves left almost no testimony. Captured Luftwaffe engineers denied knowledge of Morgenstern, insisting they had been working only on conventional bombers and fighters. Yet their denials contrast with field evidence. A partially translated technical document recovered near Sabah referred to Fernaufklärungsgerät ohne Besatzung, long-range reconnaissance device without crew. The document also included references to Steuerung über Funk, guidance by radio, a primitive form of remote piloting. Allied interrogators dismissed the possibility, considering it beyond German capacity, though within 20 years the United States itself would be testing drones with similar specifications. The dismantling of the airfields was swift and thorough. By late 1943, bulldozers had leveled runways, hangars were collapsed, and all machinery loaded onto transports bound for Malta. Official maps of the region were redrawn, removing references to the sites. The Royal Engineers who carried out the demolition were instructed to record the facilities as enemy supply dumps. Any mention of prototypes was deleted from final reports. Soldiers present later recalled that crates containing fuselage parts were flown under heavy guard to secret storage at Wright Field in Ohio. American engineers, when asked in the late 1940s about the origins of their drone research, spoke cryptically of German desert inspirations. The story nearly vanished until fragments reappeared in post-war research. In 1956, during hearings before a US Senate subcommittee on guided missile development, one witness referred obliquely to Axis desert prototypes recovered during the Tunisian campaign. The statement was quickly stricken from the record. Similarly, a declassified CIA briefing from 1962 mentioned early enemy pilotless aircraft trials, but offered no further detail. These hints, coupled with oral histories from veterans, kept alive speculation that Morgenstern had indeed been real. Local inhabitants of the Fezzan region also contributed to the mystery. In interviews recorded in the 1970s, Libyan nomads recalled seeing strange birds of metal assembled by Germans in the desert. One elder described engines that screamed louder than any plane he had heard, though the machines never flew. Whether these were prototypes under testing or merely discarded parts is unclear, but their memories align with Allied reports of pulse jet components found abandoned on site. Why the Germans would pursue such a project in the remote North African desert remains unanswered. Some historians suggest it was an attempt to hide experimental work from Allied bombing raids, using the vast emptiness of the Sahara as cover. Others argue the project was intended to test the feasibility of long-range unmanned reconnaissance flights over Allied positions, with the desert offering an open-air laboratory away from civilian eyes. The project's sudden abandonment coincided with Rommel's retreat and the collapse of Axis supply lines, leaving Morgenstern an unfinished ghost of ambition. The deliberate erasure of the airfields from history is perhaps most telling. When researchers requested access to Air Ministry files in the 1980s, they found entire folders withdrawn, marked sensitive technology, restricted until 2043. Such long embargoes suggest the material was considered too closely related to ongoing developments in aerospace. Meanwhile, American archives offered little beyond sanitized references to foreign airframe parts. For those who stumbled upon the ruins decades later, the desert itself seemed complicit in the silence. Aerial surveys conducted in the 1960s revealed faint outlines of runways half buried in sand. Pilots flying over Fezzan reported geometric shapes in the terrain, suggestive of human construction but dismissed by official surveyors. To this day, traces of Morgenstern remain etched faintly into the desert, erased from paper, but not from the land. The ghost airfields of North Africa embody the strange intersection of truth and erasure. They hint at a technological ambition the Reich could not realize but which others would later pursue. They also reveal how swiftly wartime discoveries were hidden, folded into post-war programs, and rewritten out of official histories. What began as abandoned hangars in the Libyan desert became part of a shadow archive of knowledge, transferred, classified, and denied. In the end, Project Morgenstern was less a functioning weapon than a glimpse into possibilities. Yet its discovery forced the Allies to confront an unsettling truth, that the race for unmanned flight and remote-controlled war had begun not in the laboratories of the Cold War, but in the forgotten airstrips of a retreating army. The airfields may have been buried, but their ghost continues to haunt the lineage of modern warfare, a reminder that even in the desert sands of North Africa, the future had already taken shape. The official records close with medals, treaties, and memorials, but beneath those pages lies another ledger, one written in vanishing ink. The abandoned sites, the confiscated files, the signals that faded without explanation. They linger like ghosts, pressing against the edges of history's locked doors. In these shadows, certainty is the first casualty, and silence is the only language spoken. Perhaps what is hidden was never meant to be found, or perhaps it waits, patient and intact, for those willing to listen beyond the static. The truth may not destroy us, but the knowledge that it was hidden might. These echoes, erased yet never gone, remind us that history's darkest corridors are not illuminated by what we know, but by what we are never allowed to see.